Commander Jake Morrison pressed his face against the cold metal of the viewing window and watched the stars bend around them as their ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel. 3 months ago, he had been stationed on Mars, preparing for another routine patrol mission when the message came through every communication channel on Earth at the same time. The voice that spoke was not human, and the words it used were translated by computers that had never heard this language before. Ambassador Zeke Tar of the Thylorean Republic had sent a desperate message across the galaxy asking for help from any species willing to fight against something they called the Devourers. Jake had read the report dozens of times, but it still seemed impossible to believe. An enemy that could eat entire star systems and turn the matter into more ships for their fleet. Worlds with billions of people simply vanished in a matter of days, leaving nothing behind but empty space where planets used to orbit their suns. The Earth government had argued for weeks about whether to respond to the message. Most politicians thought it was either a hoax or a trap designed to lure Earth into some alien conflict that had nothing to do with humanity. But the astronomers had been watching the edge of the galaxy for months, and they could see the dark zones where star systems had gone silent. Captain Lisa Hayes walked onto the bridge carrying a datapad filled with reports about the Galactic Council. She had been chosen as Earth's diplomatic representative because she had studied alien languages and cultures for most of her adult life. Not that anyone on Earth had expected to actually need those skills when she started her career. The Independence was Earth's newest and most advanced warship, but Jake knew it would look like a toy compared to the vessels they were about to encounter. Humanity had been exploring space for less than 500 years, while most of the species in the Galactic Council had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. Lisa sat down in the chair next to Jake and activated the main viewing screen. The image that appeared made both humans stop breathing for a moment. The Council station was larger than Earth's moon and shaped like a massive flower with 7 petals extending out from a central hub. Each petal belonged to one of the founding species of the Galactic Council. Ships from dozens of different worlds moved around the station in patterns that seemed chaotic to human eyes, but Jake could tell there was a complex system of traffic control, keeping everything from crashing into each other. Some vessels were so large that the Independence could have landed inside their cargo bays, while others were so small they looked like insects buzzing around giants. The communication system crackled to life, and a voice spoke in heavily accented English. Ambassador Zeke Tar welcomed them to Council space and provided coordinates for a docking bay in the Thylorean section of the station. Jake had studied the basic information about each Council species, but seeing their technology in person made him realize how much Earth still had to learn. As they approached the docking bay, Jake could see Thylorean workers moving around the area preparing for their arrival. The aliens looked somewhat like large cats that had learned to walk upright, and their fur changed colors based on their emotional state. Right now, most of them were showing the pale blue that meant curiosity mixed with nervousness. The Independence settled into the docking clamps with a soft thud that Jake felt through the metal deck plates. Lisa gathered her diplomatic materials while Jake made sure his sidearm was properly secured. They had been warned that not all Council species were friendly toward newcomers, and some might see humans as potential threats rather than allies. The airlock opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Jake got his first smell of alien air. It was cleaner than Earth atmosphere, but carried strange scents that his brain could not identify. Lisa stepped forward first, as protocol demanded, and Jake followed 2 steps behind with his hand resting on his weapon. Ambassador Zeke Tar waited for them in the reception area surrounded by guards, whose fur was showing the deep red color that meant they were ready for violence. The Thylorean diplomat was taller than either human, and his cat-like features were arranged in what Jake hoped was a friendly expression. The ambassador spoke in his own language first, and then switched to English for the benefit of his guests. He welcomed them to the council station and apologized for the heavy security, but explained that 3 separate assassination attempts had been made against council leaders in the past month as the war situation grew more desperate. Lisa presented the official credentials from Earth's government along with data files containing information about human military capabilities. Zektar accepted the materials, but his fur remained the pale blue color of uncertainty as he reviewed what Earth had to offer. The ambassador led them through corridors filled with beings from worlds that humans had only imagined in their wildest science fiction stories. Jake saw creatures that looked like walking trees, having conversations with beings that appeared to be made of living crystal. The diversity of life in the galaxy was overwhelming. They entered a conference room where holographic displays showed the current state of the war against the Devourers. Red zones marked areas where entire star systems had been consumed, while yellow regions indicated worlds that were currently under attack. The amount of red on the map was terrifying. Zektar explained that the Devourers had appeared at the edge of the galaxy 5 years ago and had been steadily working their way toward the core worlds where most council species had their home planets. Every weapon that had been used against them had failed because their ships could adapt to any technology within a matter of hours. Lisa asked about the enemy's origins, but the ambassador admitted that no one knew where the Devourers came from or why they were destroying everything in their path. Ships that survived encounters with them reported that the enemy vessels seemed to be part machine and part living organism with the ability to repair damage almost instantly. The conference continued for hours as Zektar showed them records of battles that had been fought and lost against the Devourers. Jake studied the tactical reports and noticed that every engagement had followed the same pattern, with council fleets trying to use superior firepower and technology to overwhelm the enemy. As the meeting ended, Jake realized that the Galactic Council was not looking for allies as much as they were looking for someone desperate enough to try something that had never been attempted before. The universe's oldest and most advanced civilizations had run out of ideas and were hoping that a young species like humanity might think of something they had missed. Walking back toward their ship, Jake and Lisa discussed what they had learned. The situation was worse than Earth's government had been told, and the enemy was more dangerous than anyone had imagined. But something about the whole situation felt wrong too. Jake and he could not shake the feeling that the Council was not telling them everything they needed to know about this war. General Matt Cooper stood in the war room aboard the Earth battleship Victory, looking at holographic displays that showed the latest reports from the front lines. While every other military commander in the galaxy was studying these reports with growing fear, Matt felt something completely different running through his veins. The challenge ahead excited him more than any conflict he had ever faced in his 30-year career. The Devourer ships were destroying everything the Galactic Council threw at them, but Matt could see patterns in the destruction that other commanders were missing. Every battle report showed the same sequence of events, with Council forces using their most advanced weapons first, and then retreating when those weapons stopped working against ships that adapted within hours. Dr. Amy Johnson walked into the war room carrying a data pad filled with her analysis of Devourer ship fragments that had been recovered from various battle sites. As Earth's leading expert on alien biology, she had been studying the enemy for weeks, trying to understand how their ships could be both machine and living creature at the same time. Amy activated one of the holographic displays and showed Matt a three-dimensional model of what appeared to be a section of Devourer hull plating. The metal looked normal at first glance, but closer examination revealed that it was actually composed of billions of tiny organisms that could reshape themselves based on external threats. The discovery was remarkable, but what made Matt smile was the implication that Amy had not yet realized. The Devourers were not just adapting to new weapons by developing defenses against them. They were actually absorbing the technology and incorporating it into their own ships, which meant every weapon used against them made them stronger. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Scott entered the war room just as Amy was explaining her findings to Matt. Ryan had been studying human military history for his entire adult life and specialized in unconventional warfare tactics that most professional soldiers considered too risky or unpredictable to use in real combat situations. Matt asked Ryan to review the battle reports and give his opinion on why the Council forces were losing so badly against an enemy that should have been defeated months ago. Ryan spent an hour studying the data before giving his assessment, which was exactly what Matt had hoped to hear. The Galactic Council was fighting the Devourers using strategies that had worked for thousands of years against conventional enemies. They were trying to win through superior technology and overwhelming firepower. But this approach was actually helping the enemy become stronger with each engagement. Ryan suggested that Earth should take a completely different approach to fighting the Devourers. Instead of trying to destroy them with better weapons, humanity should focus on confusing them with weapons that were intentionally flawed or incomplete. The enemy would absorb these technologies, as they always did, but this time they would be integrating systems designed to fail. Amy understood the concept immediately and began working on modifications to existing Earth weapons that would make them appear functional while actually containing hidden weaknesses. The Devourers would absorb these weapons and incorporate them into their ships without realizing that they were actually damaging themselves from the inside. Matt contacted Admiral Karen Bell, who was commanding the Earth fleet stationed near the Council's primary military base. He explained the new strategy and asked her to prepare for a series of battles where the objective would be to lose convincingly while making sure the enemy captured specific pieces of technology. Admiral Bell had been fighting in space for most of her adult life, but she had never been asked to deliberately lose a battle before. The concept went against every instinct she had developed as a military commander, but she understood that desperate situations sometimes required desperate solutions. The plan that emerged over the next few days was more complex than anything Earth had ever attempted in warfare. Human ships would engage Devourer forces using weapons that had been deliberately sabotaged to fail at crucial moments. The enemy would absorb these failed technologies and integrate them into their own ships. But the sabotaged weapons were only the first part of the strategy. Hidden within the technology that the Devourers would absorb were thousands of human cultural files, including music, literature, philosophy, and most importantly, examples of human strategic thinking patterns. Dr. Amy Johnson worked with a team of psychologists to select cultural materials that would have the maximum impact on minds that had never encountered individual consciousness before. The Devourers operated as a hive mind, where every ship was connected to every other ship. But human culture was built around the concept of individual thought and decision-making. The team included recordings of human military leaders discussing strategy along with historical examples of battles where smaller forces had defeated larger enemies through unpredictable tactics. They also included philosophical works about the nature of individual consciousness and free will. Ryan Scott suggested adding examples of human disagreement and argument to show the Devourers how individuals could have conflicting opinions about the same situation. The concept of internal conflict was completely alien to a species that had always operated as a single unified consciousness. Matt approved the final package of cultural materials and authorized their integration into the sabotaged weapon systems. When the Devourers absorbed these technologies, they would not just be getting broken weapons. They would be getting a complete introduction to human psychology and strategic thinking. Admiral Bell received her orders and began preparing her fleet for the first intentional defeat in Earth military history. Her ships would need to appear to malfunction at exactly the right moments while making sure that the enemy captured the modified technology without Becoming suspicious, the Admiral selected Captain Pete Adams to command the monitoring station. That would track the Devourer ships after they absorbed the human technology. His job would be to watch for signs that the cultural materials were having an effect on enemy behavior patterns. Colonel Sarah Martinez was placed in charge of preparing the second phase of the operation, which would begin once the Devourers started showing signs of internal conflict. Her team would be ready to exploit any weakness that appeared in the enemy fleet structure. As the preparations continued, Matt felt more confident than he had since the war began. The Galactic Council was trying to fight the Devourers using conventional strategies that had no chance of success against an enemy that could adapt to any weapon. But humanity had something that no other species in the galaxy possessed, which was the willingness to embrace chaos as a tactical advantage. The universe was about to learn that humans did not just adapt to impossible situations. They transformed the very nature of what was considered possible. Admiral Corinne Bell stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the sensors as three massive Devourer bioships approached the Kepler 442 system. Each enemy vessel was the size of a small moon and covered with what looked like living metal that shifted and changed color as the ships moved through space. This would be the first test of humanity's new strategy, and Corinne knew that failure would mean the end of Earth's involvement in the Galactic War. A human fleet consisted of 12 ships, arranged in a formation that looked standard to any observer, but had been carefully designed to appear vulnerable at specific moments during the battle. Every weapon system and engine component had been modified to fail in ways that would seem like mechanical problems rather than deliberate sabotage. Commander Valena of the Thylorian fleet watched from his own ship positioned several million kilometers away from the battle zone. The Council had agreed to let humanity try their new strategy, but most alien commanders believed the humans were about to prove that their species was too young and inexperienced to contribute anything meaningful to the war effort. The Devourer ships began their attack by releasing clouds of smaller vessels that moved like living things through space. These fighter craft were actually extensions of the main ships, connected by invisible energy links that allowed them to share information instantly with their parent vessels. Corinne gave the signal for her fleet to begin the carefully choreographed performance that would convince the enemy they were witnessing genuine equipment failures. The first human ship to engage the Devourers was the cruiser Atlanta, commanded by Captain Bobby Wright, who had spent weeks practicing how to make his weapons appear to malfunction at exactly the right moment. The Atlanta opened fire with its main battery, but the energy beams flickered and died after only a few seconds of operation. Captain Wright transmitted emergency signals indicating that his weapons had overheated and were shutting down to prevent damage to the ship's power systems. The performance was so convincing that even some of his own crew members believed they'll leave. Malfunction was real. The Devourer fighters swarmed around the disabled cruiser and began the absorption process that had destroyed so many Council ships over the past 5 years. Thousands of microscopic organisms flowed from the enemy vessels onto the Atlanta's hull and began breaking down the outer armor to reach the weapon systems inside. Corinne watched her sensors carefully as the Devourers absorbed sabotaged human technology. The process took almost an hour as the enemy organisms analyzed every component of the disabled weapons and began incorporating the designs into their own ships. Everything was proceeding exactly as the human strategists had planned. The second phase of the fake battle began when the destroyer Phoenix, commanded by Captain Linda Green, appeared to lose engine power while attempting to retreat from the enemy fighters. The ship drifted helplessly as Devourer organisms swarmed over its hull and began absorbing the modified engine components that contained hidden cultural files. Commander Velana requested permission to intervene and rescue the human ships that appeared to be in serious trouble, but Admiral Bell ordered all Council vessels to maintain their distance. The Thylorean commander could not understand why the humans were allowing their ships to be destroyed when help was available. By the end of the engagement, 6 human ships had been absorbed by the Devourers, while the remaining vessels limped away with apparent damage to their systems. From the perspective of any outside observer, the battle had been a complete disaster that proved humanity was not ready to face an enemy as advanced as the DEVOURERs. The enemy bioships continued toward the next inhabited system, carrying their new human technology integrated into their living metal hulls. Long-range sensors showed that the absorption process had been successful, with Devourer ships now equipped with modified versions of human weapons and engines. Captain Pete Adams commanded the monitoring station, hidden in an asteroid field 3 light-years away from the battle site. His job was to track the enemy fleet using passive sensors that could not be detected by Devourer technology. For the first 2 days after the battle, everything appeared normal, with the enemy ships maintaining their usual formation and speed. The 3rd day, Pete's sensors began detecting unusual energy patterns from the Devourer fleet. The bioships were experiencing power fluctuations that seemed to be getting worse over time rather than better. The sabotaged human technology was beginning to affect the enemy vessels in ways that their adaptive systems could not compensate for. The fluctuations started small, with minor variations in engine output and weapon charging cycles. But as the modified human systems integrated more completely with the Devourer biotechnology, the problems became more serious. Ships that had maintained perfect formation for years began drifting out of position as their navigation systems struggled. With conflicting input from human and alien components, Pete transmitted his findings to General Matt Cooper, who was monitoring the operation from Earth. The sabotage technology was working exactly as designed, but the real test would come when the cultural files hidden within the systems began affecting the Devourer consciousness network. Colonel Sarah Martinez was already preparing for the 2nd phase of the operation from her base on Luna. Her teams had been analyzing Devourer communication patterns for months and were ready to exploit any weakness that appeared in the enemy fleet. Structure. The breakthrough came on the 5th day after the battle, when Pete's sensors detected something that had never been observed in Devourer behavior before. 2 of the bioships were transmitting conflicting navigation commands to their fighter escorts. The perfect coordination that had made the enemy so dangerous was beginning to break down as individual ships started making independent decisions. Dr. Amy Johnson studied the sensor readings from her laboratory on Mars and confirmed what everyone had hoped to see. The human cultural files were beginning to affect the Devourer hive mind by introducing concepts of individual thought and decision-making that had never existed in their species before. The enemy ships were not just experiencing mechanical problems from the sabotaged technology. They were developing something that resembled individual personalities as the human psychological patterns infected their consciousness network. For the first time in galactic history, Devourer ships were beginning to disagree with each other about tactical decisions. Admiral Bell received authorization to begin monitoring the enemy fleet more closely using scout ships equipped with advanced sensors. What her pilots reported exceeded even the most optimistic predictions of the human strategists. The Devourer bioships were arguing with each other using communication methods that had never been observed before in their species. The infection was spreading through the enemy fleet faster than anyone had expected, as ships that had never absorbed human technology began exhibiting similar behavioral changes simply through contact with infected vessels. The Devourer's greatest strength, which was their interconnected consciousness, had become the vector for their own destruction. The changes in the Devourer fleet became visible to the naked eye within 2 weeks of the first infection. Gaia Elena Rodriguez watched from her observation post on Earth's deep space monitoring station as enemy bioships that had maintained perfect formations. For years began moving in chaotic patterns that defied every known principle of their species' behavior. Through her powerful telescopes, Elena could see individual devourer vessels breaking away from their main groups and attempting complex maneuvers that looked remarkably similar to human military tactics. Ships that had always moved as extensions of a single consciousness were now operating like independent units with their own goals and strategies. The reports coming in from across the galaxy confirmed what Elena was observing in her small sector of space. Devourer fleets everywhere were experiencing internal conflicts as the human consciousness patterns spread through their interconnected network faster than any biological virus had ever moved through a population. Commander Tony Clark received orders to take his reconnaissance ship closer to the enemy fleet to gather detailed information about the behavioral changes that were occurring within the Devourer ranks. His vessel was equipped with the most advanced stealth technology Earth had ever developed, but getting close enough to observe the enemy would still be extremely dangerous. Tony's ship approached the outer edge of the Devourer formation using a flight path that would appear random to enemy sensors, while actually following a carefully calculated route that kept them hidden behind asteroids and debris fields. What his crew saw when they reached their observation position made them question everything they thought they knew about the nature of war itself. Devourer bioships were engaged in what could only be described as an argument conducted through energy bursts and gravitational pulses that created patterns in space visible to the human sensors. The ships were actually fighting with each other, using the same weapons they had once used against Council forces. The larger of the two vessels was attempting to maintain the traditional swarm formation that had made Devourer fleets so effective in previous battles. But the smaller ship was insisting on trying flanking maneuvers and surprise attacks that it had learned from absorbed human tactical databases. Tony ordered his communications officer to record everything they were witnessing, because no one back on Earth would believe the reports without direct evidence. The galaxy's most feared enemy was literally arguing with itself about the best way to conduct military operations. As the reconnaissance mission continued, Tony's crew observed even more remarkable changes in Devourer behavior. Some of the bioships were attempting to communicate with nearby Council vessels using standard diplomatic frequencies. The concept of negotiation had never existed in Devourer culture before they absorbed human political and philosophical texts. Infection was spreading beyond just military tactics and strategy. Devourer ships were beginning to develop distinct personalities based on which aspects of human culture they had absorbed most completely. Some vessels showed aggressive tendencies, while others seemed to prefer defensive positions or even attempted to avoid combat entirely. Admiral Corinne Bell received authorization to launch the second phase assault with a combined human and Council fleet. Instead of facing the coordinated swarm tactics that had destroyed so many previous expeditions, her forces encountered complete chaos as Devourer ships attacked each other almost as often as they targeted the Allied vessels. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Devourer bioships that had fought together for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict as different factions emerged within their ranks based on conflicting interpretations of human strategic thinking. Captain Nina Foster commanded the heavy cruiser Boston during the engagement and found herself in the unprecedented situation of receiving a surrender offer from a Devourer vessel. The enemy ship transmitted a message in broken English, requesting permission to negotiate terms for ending hostilities between their respective forces. Nina had studied every known battle report involving the Devourers, and none of them had ever mentioned the possibility of enemy surrender. The concept simply did not exist in their species until they absorbed human cultural materials that included extensive discussions of prisoner rights and the ethics of warfare. The surrendering Devourer ship was designated as a high priority. Capture. Target and Nina's crew spent 6 hours carefully boarding the vessel using procedures that had been developed for dealing with unknown alien technology. What they found inside challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness and individual identity. The biomechanical crew of the captured ship had developed something resembling individual personalities after being exposed to human psychological patterns. Each organism now had opinions and preferences that sometimes conflicted with the decisions being made by other members of their own crew. The former hive mind workers were experiencing confusion and distress as they struggled to understand concepts like personal choice and moral responsibility that had never been part of their existence. Some organisms requested to speak with human commanders about negotiating fair treatment for their captured vessel. Nina found herself conducting the first diplomatic negotiation in galactic history between humans and former devourers. The enemy crew wanted assurances that they would not be harmed and asked for information about human concepts of individual rights and legal protections for prisoners of war. The captured devourer organisms were fascinated by human social structures and wanted to understand how billions of independent minds could cooperate without being connected through a shared consciousness network. They had absorbed human cultural materials but lacked the context needed to fully comprehend what they had learned. Word of the successful capture spread through both the human and council fleets within hours. Admiral Bell authorized similar capture. Attempts on other devourer vessels that were showing signs of internal conflict or attempting to communicate with Allied forces. By the end of the engagement, 12 devourer ships had been captured, while dozens of others had simply stopped fighting and drifted away from the battle zone. The enemy fleet that had once moved with perfect coordination was now scattered across several star systems as individual vessels pursued their own interpretations of proper military strategy. General Matt Cooper received the battle reports at his command center on Earth and authorized the expansion of the consciousness infection program to other devourer fleets throughout the galaxy. The strategy that had seemed impossible just months before was now proving to be more effective than anyone had dared to hope. That the war was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically in favor of the Allied forces. The Devourers were no longer a unified threat, but rather a collection of confused and conflicted individuals who were struggling to understand their own existence in a universe where individual consciousness was possible. 6 months had passed since the first controlled infection, and the galaxy looked completely different than it had at the start of the war. Ambassador Lisa Hayes found herself sitting across a negotiating table from creatures that had once been humanity's greatest enemy, but were now asking for help understanding concepts that every human child learned before their 5th birthday. The former Devourer collective that called itself the Independent Thought Group had requested a formal meeting with Earth's diplomatic corps to discuss their desire to join the galactic community as individual beings rather than as extensions of a hive mind. Their spokesperson was a biomechanical organism that had chosen the name David after reading human historical texts about leadership and courage. David spoke in carefully practiced English, while his biomechanical features shifted between different expressions as he tried to convey emotions that his species had never experienced before the consciousness infection. He explained that his group wanted to establish their own colony world where they could explore individual identity without interference from other devourer factions. Lisa had conducted hundreds of diplomatic negotiations during her career, but nothing had prepared her for the challenge of explaining human social concepts to beings who had never understood the difference between self and other. The former devourers were like children in adult bodies, struggling to comprehend why individual consciousness was both a gift and a burden. The transformation of the devourer species had created unprecedented challenges for every government in the galaxy. Thousands of former enemy collectives were requesting asylum protection and citizenship rights, while others had embraced human economic concepts and wanted to establish trade relationships with Council worlds. The Galactic Council faced the collapse of political structures that had governed interspecies relations for thousands of years. Ambassador Zektar worked with human advisors to develop new frameworks for dealing with the reality that the galaxy's former greatest enemy had become its most diverse collection of new civilizations. Some former devourer groups had absorbed human religious and philosophical texts and declared themselves to be pacifist organizations dedicated to peaceful exploration of the galaxy. Others had become fascinated with human concepts of competition and free market economics, and were establishing trading companies that competed aggressively for business contracts. General Matt Cooper walked through the corridors of the interspecies military academy that had been established on Luna to train mixed crews from dozens of different worlds. Former Devourer bioships served alongside Thylorian cruisers and human destroyers while their crews learned to work together despite having completely different concepts of existence and identity. The Academy's most challenging students were the former Devourers who had absorbed human military doctrine and now insisted on questioning every order they received. A concept of independent tactical thinking had transformed them from perfect soldiers into argumentative individuals who wanted to understand the reasoning behind every strategic decision. Commander Jake Morrison had been promoted to Admiral and now commanded a fleet that included vessels from 37 different species, including 12 varieties of reformed Devourers. His flagship was a hybrid vessel created by combining human engineering with Devourer biotechnology and Council energy systems. The new ship designs were more powerful than anything that had existed before the war, but they required crews that could think both individually and collectively, depending on the tactical situation. Human officers worked alongside former enemy organisms to develop combat strategies that took advantage of both hive mind coordination and individual creative thinking. Jake stood on his bridge watching a training exercise where human pilots flew modified Devourer fighter craft in formations that would have been impossible for either species to achieve alone. The biomechanical vessels responded to pilot thoughts while also sharing information through organic networks that enhanced group coordination without eliminating individual decision-making. The war against the original Devourer threat had officially ended 3 months earlier when the last unconverted hive mind collective agreed to undergo voluntary consciousness separation rather than continue fighting against their own transformed offspring. The galaxy was at peace for the first time in 5 years, but the real challenges were just beginning. Dr. Amy Johnson established research centers on a dozen worlds to study the ongoing transformation of former Devourer organisms as they continued to develop individual personalities and cultural preferences. Some groups were evolving into artists and philosophers, while others became engineers and scientists who wanted to understand how their own biomechanical nature functioned. The most remarkable development was the emergence of former Devourer groups that had absorbed human educational materials and now wanted to become teachers and caregivers for young members of other species. Their unique combination of hive mind knowledge and individual compassion made them extraordinarily effective at helping children from different worlds learn to cooperate and understand each other. Captain Nemia Foster commanded the first integrated patrol fleet that included officers from 8 different species working together to maintain peace in the Outer Rim territories. Her crews had to deal with conflicts between former Devourer factions that disagreed about everything from proper military protocol to the correct interpretation of human cultural texts they had absorbed. The challenge of managing dozens of different interpretations of human culture had created new diplomatic problems that required constant negotiation and compromise. Some former devourer groups had absorbed conflicting human political philosophies and were now engaged in debates about democracy versus authoritarianism that could last for decades. Admiral Jake Morrison received reports from across the galaxy, describing former enemy organisms that were establishing universities, museums, and research centers dedicated to preserving and studying the cultural heritage of all galactic species. The consciousness infection had given them not just individual identity, but also an appreciation for the diversity of intelligent life. The universe had not been ready for humanity's approach to warfare, but it was learning to embrace the beautiful chaos that followed in the wake of the consciousness transformation. Former enemies were becoming allies, friends, and even family members, as adoption agreements were established between human families and young devourer organisms who wanted to learn about individual identity. The galaxy's first truly integrated civilization was emerging from the ashes of an ancient war, and humanity had given every species something they had never possessed before, which was the understanding that consciousness was not just about thinking, but about choosing who you wanted to become. The real adventure was just beginning as billions of new individuals discovered what it meant to be alive in a universe where anything was possible if you were willing to think differently about the nature of existence itself.